My brothers and sisters, listen close. There are moments in history that are not whispered but thundered across mountains and oceans. The Alaska Summit was one such moment. A truth was unveiled, a fire was lit, and the world felt the tremor of India's rise. At that summit, India did not come as a follower, nor as a quiet guest at the table of great nations. India came as a voice unshaken, rooted in centuries of struggle, sacrifice, and survival. Like a tree whose roots run deep into the soil of dignity, India stood tall, declaring, "We are not here to be overlooked. We are here to be heard." That moment was more than a diplomatic exchange, it was a declaration of being. For too long, many in the world had looked at India as a market, a resource, or a participant in the designs of others. But on that day, India revealed itself as an architect of its own destiny, one whose vision and determination could no longer be underestimated. The Alaska Summit became a stage not for performance but for presence. Every word, every pause, every look from the Indian delegation carried the weight of a nation that had risen through storms of colonization, economic trials, wars, and poverty, and had turned its scars into stars. India's arrival was not adorned with pomp or bluster. It was dignified, measured, and yet profoundly powerful. Nations of the world sat expecting negotiations, but what they encountered was a new chapter in global discourse. The truth that India carried was one of resolve, the quiet confidence that comes not from borrowed strength, but from earned resilience. It was the kind of confidence that is born when a people learn to endure hunger and still feed hope, when a country is told it is weak but still dares to dream. That spirit cannot be shaken because it has already faced the worst and refused to be broken. In the air of that summit hall, one could sense that this was not the India of yesterday. This was not a voice speaking timidly at the margins. This was the voice of a nation unafraid of its size, unashamed of its heritage, and unyielding in its vision of tomorrow. To some it was a shock, to others it was an awakening. But for India itself, it was simply the truth finally spoken in its full measure. The dignity of standing tall is not in denying others their place, but in claiming your own without hesitation or apology. That was India's stance, firm, respectful, but unmistakable. Centuries of history whispered through those moments. The echoes of freedom fighters who marched barefoot against empires, the voices of farmers who tilled barren land with nothing but faith, the dreams of poets and philosophers who imagined an India free, fair, and fearless. All of them seemed present in that room. When India spoke, it was not just the voice of diplomats, but of millions of ordinary citizens whose daily labor builds the extraordinary story of the nation. Each syllable carried the cadence of resilience, the rhythm of survival, and the song of determination. To be heard at last is not a matter of volume but of weight. India's words carried weight because they came from experience, from journeys carved out of hardship, and from triumphs won against the odds. That it was not about confrontation, but about clarity. Clarity that India would no longer be defined by the perceptions of others, but by its own actions and its own truth. Clarity that it would stand not behind, but alongside, as an equal partner in shaping the destiny of the world. The table of great nations was no longer complete without India's firm presence. It was a moment of recognition, not demanded but commanded. And in that recognition, the world saw something undeniable, that India had arrived, not as a guest waiting to be invited, but as a rightful participant whose voice could no longer be dismissed. That was the shock, that was the truth, and that was the beginning of a new story written in the ink of dignity, and spoken with the tone of unshaken resolve. What shocked the world was not arrogance, but clarity. India carried the courage of its ancestors, the determination of its youth, and the wisdom of its saints. Where others doubted, India reminded them that strength does not always roar. It sometimes speaks with steady conviction, echoing across boardrooms and battlefields alike. At the Alaska summit, there was no need for India to pound the table or raise its voice, for the very foundation of its words was enough to shake assumptions and break illusions. The clarity with which India spoke was drawn from centuries of being tested, centuries of being underestimated, and centuries of rising again and again when the world thought it could not. That clarity is what made the difference. In a world where power is often measured by military arsenals or economic dominance, India brought forward a different kind of strength, the strength of conviction. It did not have to demand attention. Its truth demanded it naturally. The courage of its ancestors echoed in the way India reminded the world that this is a nation born out of struggle, not privilege. It is a land that endured colonization, partition, and famine, yet stood resilient. That legacy gave India a moral weight, and it used that weight to speak not only for itself, but for those nations whose voices are often drowned in the noise of superpowers. The determination of its youth added fire to that moment. With the largest youth population in the world, India carries a future that cannot be ignored. These young men and women are not satisfied with mediocrity or silence. They are building, innovating, creating, and pushing the boundaries of what the country can achieve. When India spoke at the summit, it was not just diplomats speaking. It was the voice of millions of young dreamers who believe that their nation's rightful place is at the forefront of global progress. That determination lent urgency to India's message, turning it into a force that demanded acknowledgement. The wisdom of its saints balanced courage and determination with restraint and vision. For India's voice was not reckless, not driven by impulse, but grounded in a philosophy that has long taught the world the values of harmony, peace, and resilience. The summit felt the echo of those teachings, that true leadership is not about domination, but about guidance, not about exclusion, but inclusion. India's clarity lay in this wisdom, that progress must be collective, and that no nation can claim security or prosperity while leaving others behind. Many who sat across the table expected India to plead or to compromise. Instead, they found a nation clear in its purpose and unwavering in its stance. That clarity shocked the world because it was undeniable, unshakable, and unpretentious. It was the kind of truth that cannot be negotiated away, for it is rooted in reality, and reality has a way of forcing even the most powerful to stop and listen. India's presence became the reminder that influence is not always in how loudly one speaks, but in how deeply one's words resonate. Strength that does not roar but endures. That is what India carried. Its words were not wrapped in threats but in vision. They did not incite fear but inspired respect. And in that quiet yet unmovable stance, the world saw a new kind of leadership, one that comes not from the hunger to dominate, but from the clarity of knowing who you are, where you come from, and where you are destined to go. This was India's gift to the summit, the revelation that clarity is a form of power greater than noise, and conviction is a force stronger than intimidation. The Alaska summit truth was this: power no longer belongs to the few who hoard it. The balance of the earth has shifted. India's hand stretched out, not to beg, but to build, not to follow, but to lead. And that truth was felt in every eye that watched, every ear that listened, every heart that beat with anticipation of a new world order. For too long, power was confined to narrow circles, claimed by nations that believed their wealth, their weapons, and their reach gave them the sole right to direct the future of humanity. But history does not remain frozen, and destiny does not bow to tradition alone. The summit became the place where this new reality was spoken aloud, and the voice that carried it was India's. Power is not infinite when clutched tightly in the hands of a few. Like water, it slips through the cracks, flows to the valleys, nourishes new roots, and gives rise to new forests. India stood at the summit as the embodiment of that truth. It did not arrive seeking charity, nor did it arrive to echo the designs of others. Instead, it stretched out its hand with the resolve of a nation that knows its worth, a nation that has carried both wounds and victories with grace. It extended its vision of cooperation, not subordination. It declared with quiet strength that partnership is no longer optional. It is necessary. When India spoke of leadership, it was not the leadership of empire, but the leadership of example. A country that had risen from the ashes of partition, lifted millions from poverty, and built one of the largest democracies in the world, could now stand as a mirror for others. The world saw in that summit not a nation clutching desperately for recognition, but one extending recognition to others who had long been ignored. In that extension lay the shock. India was not asking for a seat at the table. It was inviting others to see that the table itself must expand, that the age of exclusivity was over. The balance of the earth is no longer a metaphor. It is a reality. Economies have shifted, populations have moved, and ideas have spread far beyond the control of a single power bloc. In this shifting balance, India's role is undeniable. Its market, its technology, its democracy, and its people all converge to form a force too vast to overlook. At the summit, that reality was not delivered as a boast, but as a truth, and truths, once spoken, cannot be undone. The anticipation that filled the air was not the expectation of conflict, but the possibility of transformation. When India declared that it did not stretch its hand to beg, but to build, the message resonated across continents. It was a call to those who still believed that might alone commands respect. It was a reminder that the 21st century would not be ruled by intimidation, but by collaboration. That the true currency of power is no longer control, but connection. India's voice carried weight because it spoke for more than itself. It spoke for the rising nations of the global south, for the marginalized voices that had too long been excluded from the decisions that shaped their lives. In doing so, India shocked the world because it shifted the spotlight from the old centers of dominance to the new centers of possibility. It reminded the powerful that their monopoly is broken, their hold is loosened, and the balance has moved. The Alaska Summit truth was not loud, but it was lasting. It was the unveiling of a new reality, that leadership today belongs not to those who hoard power, but to those who share it. India's outstretched hand was not a gesture of weakness, but of strength, and in its steadiness the world recognized that the age of the few had ended, and the age of the many had begun. India's shock was not in weapons, nor in wealth, but in will. The will to say we are not the future, we are the present. The will to declare that the dreams of 4 billion souls cannot be chained. The will to rise not above others, but alongside them, rewriting the rules of unity, trade, and respect among nations. At the Alaska Summit, this will was not shouted from podiums, but it was felt in every word spoken, and in every silence that carried unspoken truth. Nations came prepared to measure India by its resources, but they left recognizing that its true strength was something more enduring, more difficult to quantify, and more impossible to suppress. The will of a people is not built overnight. It is forged through centuries of endurance, and India has known endurance like few others. It is the will that rose when foreign empires tried to crush its spirit. It is the will that rose when poverty weighed down its millions, yet hope still glowed like a lamp in every village. It is the will that rose when wars tested its resolve, and natural disasters shook its foundations, but nothing could topple its belief in a brighter dawn. This will is not built of steel or stone, but of human spirit, and that spirit is unbreakable. At the summit, This truth shocked those who believed that power lay only in visible displays of might. For what India revealed was invisible to the eye, but undeniable to the heart, the collective determination of 1 billion dreams converging into one direction. Those dreams belonged to farmers and teachers, scientists and soldiers, laborers and leaders, all carrying within them the conviction that India's time is not tomorrow, but today. This collective spirit was the message India carried, and it was a message impossible to ignore. The will to declare, "We are not the future, we are the present," is more than a statement, it is a rejection of delay. Too often, nations like India have been told to wait for recognition, to wait for a turn at leadership, to wait for permission to rise. But waiting is no longer acceptable. India's youth, innovators, and leaders are not content to be spectators to history. They are authors of it. At the summit, this will was evident in the way India framed its stance. It was not pleading for inclusion but asserting participation. It was not requesting acknowledgement but claiming space. That is the power of will. It transforms waiting into action and aspiration into achievement. The will to rise alongside others is perhaps India's greatest shock. For in a world where nations often seek to dominate, India chose instead to cooperate. Its rise is not a threat to others, but an invitation. By speaking of unity, trade, and respect, India extended a vision where strength is multiplied by sharing, not diminished by it. This is the will that builds bridges instead of walls, that chooses dialogue over division, and that values dignity over dominance. Such a vision unsettled many because it redefined the very meaning of power, turning it from a zero, some game into a shared responsibility. Weapons can rust, and wealth can vanish, but will endures. That is the lesson the Alaska summit carried into history. India's will was not a fleeting sentiment, but a force rooted in its people's resilience, and its nation's unshakable belief in its destiny. This will did not aim to conquer or to boast. It aimed to inspire, to uplift, and to chart a path forward not just for India, but for a world that longs for balance, fairness, and hope. In that unyielding will, the world saw something it could neither dismiss nor deny, and that realization was the true shock of the summit. The Alaska summit truth was not only for India, but for the world. It was a call to remember that every nation, every people, has the right to stand tall in the light of their destiny. It was a reminder that humility and strength are not opposites, but partners in progress. When India spoke, it did not speak for itself alone. It spoke for all those voices that have too often been silenced or overlooked in the corridors of global power. The truth carried by India was not a narrow message of self-interest, but a universal one, a truth that challenged the world to reimagine its future with justice, dignity, and equality at the center. The summit became a mirror in which nations saw themselves reflected. Some saw their dominance waning and felt unease, while others saw new possibilities unfolding and felt hope. In either case, no one could ignore the moment. India's voice reminded the world that greatness is not confined to military power or economic strength. True greatness lies in the ability to lift others as you rise, to seek progress not through exclusion, but through inclusion, to embrace humility as a sign of wisdom rather than weakness. That message was not bound by geography. It was a message that resonated across every land where people still dream of recognition and respect. The call to stand tall in the light of destiny was an invitation for nations to claim their rightful place without shame or hesitation. Many countries in the global South have long been told to follow the lead of wealthier nations, to accept roles written for them by others. But the Alaska summit revealed a different path. India's message was clear. No nation should ever have to apologize for its existence, its ambition, or its dream to flourish. Each people has a destiny, and that destiny must be embraced, not delayed. This truth did not diminish the established powers, but challenged them to rise to a higher standard of leadership, one that acknowledges the dignity of all rather than the privilege of a few. What made this truth powerful was its balance of humility and strength. India did not speak with arrogance, nor did it cower in timidity. It struck the rare balance that the world often struggles to find, the humility to know it is still learning, still building, still growing, and the strength to know that its voice deserves to be heard nonetheless. In this balance lies the essence of true leadership, the kind that inspires rather than intimidates, that unites rather than divides. By modeling this balance, India gave the world a glimpse of what progress can look like when guided by wisdom rather than greed. For the world, the shock lay not only in what India said, but in what it represented. It symbolized the emergence of a new global order where power is shared, where respect is mutual, and where destiny is not dictated by a few, but shaped by the many. The Alaska Summit truth became a universal call, reminding all nations that they too have a voice, that they too must rise, and that they too are essential to the future of humanity. It was a truth that urged the powerful to rethink, and the powerless to believe again. In this way, the Alaska Summit, it was more than an event. It was a turning point. It did not belong only to India, but to every nation that has long been waiting to see itself recognized in the grand story of